The morning of August 1st, 1944, began with silence that didn't belong to a battlefield. Deep inside a fortified German command bunker near the French border, a senior Wehrmacht officer stood over a map table, his face pale, his hands still. Around him, his staff waited. Nobody spoke. The reports coming in from the front made no sense, not tactically, not strategically, not by any measure of conventional military logic. The Americans had broken out from Normandy. That much was known. But what was happening now, in the hours since dawn had crept over the hedgerows of France, was something none of them had anticipated. A division that should have been held in reserve was moving. Then another, then an entire army, not consolidating, not waiting for supply lines to catch up, not pausing to secure flanks. They were driving, fast, relentless, almost recklessly, straight into open territory. The officer tapped the map with 2 fingers. His voice, when he finally found it, was quiet, almost contemptuous. "He has overextended himself," he said. "Patton has made a fatal mistake." The room exhaled, heads nodded. The logic was sound, the reasoning solid. Every rule of warfare, every doctrine they had studied and practiced and bled for, said the same thing. An armored force that moves this fast, this far, without secured flanks and guaranteed supply, is not executing a bold maneuver. It is writing its own death sentence. The Germans were certain of it. They were wrong. And the story of exactly how wrong they were and why they could not see it coming is one of the most extraordinary chapters in the entire history of the Second World War. To understand why the Germans believed what they believed, you have to understand what warfare looked like in the summer of 1944, and more importantly, you have to understand what they thought they knew about George S. Patton. Patton was not a mystery to German military intelligence. He was, in many ways, the American general they respected most and feared most. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the legendary Desert Fox, had studied Patton's campaigns in North Africa and Sicily with the kind of grudging admiration that only one great warrior can hold for another. German officers passed around translated excerpts from Patton's speeches. They analyzed his tactics. They assigned him a profile. They thought they understood him. And that understanding, built carefully and methodically over years of observation, was precisely the thing that would destroy them. Because Patton had always been bold, that was known. But boldness, by military definition, had limits. You could be aggressive up to the edge of what your supply lines could support. You could strike hard up to the boundary where your flanks became dangerously exposed. Patton had pushed those limits before. In Sicily, he had moved with stunning speed to take Palermo in a move that surprised even Allied commanders, but he had always stopped before going past the point of no return. At least, that's what the Germans thought. What they did not know, and could not have known from the outside, was that Patton had been thinking about this moment for a very long time. Not weeks, not months, years. He had been thinking about it since before the war began, since the days when he sat in study halls and lecture rooms and pored over the campaigns of Napoleon, of Caesar, of the ancient cavalry commanders who understood that speed itself was a weapon, perhaps the most devastating weapon ever devised. Speed did not merely move troops. Speed collapsed the enemy's ability to think. Speed shattered his decision cycle. Speed arrived before the response could be organized, before the counterattack could be planned, before the reinforcements could move. Speed, applied at the right moment and the right place, could win a war in days that would otherwise take months. Patton believed this with the conviction of a man who had built his entire identity around a single strategic truth. And in the summer of 1944, with the Third Army finally under his command and the broken terrain of the Bocage behind him, he finally had the conditions to prove it on the grandest stage in history. The breakout from Normandy, Operation Cobra, had punched a hole in the German line. It was General Omar Bradley's plan, Bradley's operation, and Bradley's moment. But the exploitation of that hole, the act of pouring through it and turning a tactical breach into a strategic catastrophe for the enemy, required someone who thought differently than Bradley, differently than most Allied generals of that era. It required someone who thought like Patton. On August 1st, 1944, the Third Army was officially activated. Patton took command. What happened next was, by any honest measure, one of the most electrifying military performances of the entire 20th century. The Germans had expected him to consolidate. That was standard doctrine. Break through, widen the gap, secure the flanks, let supply catch up, then prepare the next advance. It was methodical. It was defensible. It was exactly what you did when you had just punched through an enemy line and needed to make sure you didn't lose the gains you'd made. Patton did not consolidate. He drove. The Third Army moved with a fury that the German commanders in France had never witnessed from the Americans before. Armored columns stretched across the French countryside like steel rivers, pushing 30, 40, 50 miles in a single day. Towns that the Germans had assumed would be contested for weeks fell in hours. Road junctions that were supposed to be defended found American tanks arriving before the defenders could organize. Supply convoys were still rolling up to positions that the forward units had already left behind. Inside German headquarters, confusion turned to alarm. Alarm turned to something approaching panic. Reports came in from unit commanders who couldn't get a fix on where the American spearheads actually were, because by the time the report was filed and transmitted and received and processed, the spearheads had moved again. It was in this atmosphere of controlled chaos that the German high command reached its fateful conclusion. Patton had lost control of his operation. It seemed like the only logical explanation. No general who still commanded his forces could be moving this fast. The supply lines were stretched beyond any rational calculation of sustainability. The flanks were exposed in ways that invited destruction. The leading elements were so far ahead of their support that any German counterattack of sufficient strength could cut them off and destroy them in detail. The Germans began planning exactly that counterattack. This is where the story becomes genuinely extraordinary, because the German decision to believe Patton had made a fatal mistake was not made by fools or amateurs. It was made by experienced, capable, battle-hardened officers who had fought across Europe and North Africa and the Eastern Front. Officers who understood armored warfare deeply. Officers who, by any standard of military judgment that existed at that time, had every right to believe what they believed, and yet they were wrong on nearly every count. Because the truth about what Patton was doing, the truth that the German commanders could not see from their position, was that the speed was not a loss of control. It was the plan. Every mile the Third Army covered was a mile that had been thought about, argued over, and chosen deliberately. The apparent recklessness was the most calculated military operation Patton had ever conducted. The supply question, which loomed so large in German thinking, had been addressed in ways that German intelligence simply had no visibility into. Patton's logistics officers had worked out, with almost obsessive precision, what the army could carry on its vehicles, what it could capture from the enemy, and what it could do without temporarily in exchange for the strategic gains speed would produce. They had calculated the fuel consumption of every major armored unit. They had mapped the fuel dumps left behind by the German retreat. They knew, within a margin that was tight but workable, exactly how far they could go before they needed resupply. It was not comfortable math. It was not safe math. But it was real math, grounded in specific numbers and specific plans, not the vague overconfidence that the Germans assumed was driving it. Patton himself drove the calculation obsessively. He checked fuel reports multiple times a day. He personally intervened when supply officers fell behind. He routed convoys with the same intensity he applied to combat decisions, because he understood, in a way that perhaps only he fully understood among the senior Allied commanders, that in a campaign of this kind, logistics was not separate from tactics. Logistics was tactics. The fuel in the tank was as decisive as the shell in the gun. The flank exposure, which frightened the Germans so deeply, was real. Patton knew it was real, but it was also managed. The Third Army was moving through territory where the German forces were themselves in disorder, retreating faster than they could form coherent defensive lines. The exposed flanks were not, in most places, actually being observed by enemy forces capable of exploiting them. It was a gamble, yes, but it was a calibrated gamble, based on constant intelligence about German positions and capabilities, not blind courage. There is a moment, somewhere in the middle of August 1944, that captures the entire dynamic with stunning clarity. A German armored force, assembling under orders from Hitler himself, prepared to strike westward through the town of Mortain. The goal was to cut the corridor through which the Third Army's supplies flowed, essentially severing Patton's forces from their base. If it succeeded, it would do exactly what the German commanders believed the situation demanded: exploit the overextension, cut the lines, and destroy the forces that had raced ahead of their support. Hitler ordered the attack. He was, in this particular instance, thinking along the same lines as his field commanders, that Patton had given them an opening, that the extended American position was a vulnerability, that a sharp blow at the right point would turn German crisis into American catastrophe. The attack went in on August 7th, and it was, within days, turning into one of the worst disasters the German army would suffer in the entire Western campaign. Because what Hitler and his generals had not accounted for was that Bradley and Patton both saw it coming, and instead of pulling back, they chose to let the German forces push into the corridor and then close behind them. The Third Army, rather than being cut off and destroyed, swung south and east, moving to encircle the very forces that had been sent to destroy it. The Falaise Pocket, the cauldron that developed over the following days, became a killing ground of almost incomprehensible scale. Entire German armies were trapped. Columns of vehicles, horses, men, and equipment crowded into a narrowing trap as Allied forces closed from the north, south, and east. The German attempt to exploit Patton's supposed fatal mistake ended with an estimated 50,000 German soldiers taken prisoner and another 10,000 killed, with the equipment of multiple armored divisions left burning across the French countryside. The generals who had looked at that map in August and said quietly, certainly, that Patton had overextended himself, were now watching through binoculars as their own forces were encircled in the very territory they had meant to use as a killing ground. It is worth pausing here to ask a question that military historians have wrestled with ever since. How did the Germans get it so wrong? The answer, when you dig into it, reveals something profound about how military intelligence and strategic assessment actually work, and about how even brilliant, experienced commanders can be defeated not by their enemy's strength, but by their own framework of assumptions. The German officers who assessed Patton's movements were using a standard of judgment built on decades of military experience and doctrine. They were not wrong about the risks. The risks were real. An armored force moving at that speed with those supply lines was, by any conventional measure, in a dangerous position. They correctly identified the exposure. They correctly identified the vulnerability. What they got wrong was the context. They applied a doctrine built for normal commanders to a commander who was not normal. They measured Patton by the standard of what a typical general would do in his position, without fully accounting for the possibility that Patton had calculated the risks differently, managed the logistics differently, and was operating on a strategic timeline that made those risks acceptable in ways that no conventional calculation would reveal. They also, critically, underestimated how much Patton understood their own thinking. Because Patton had studied the Germans as intensely as they had studied him. He knew how they would interpret his movements. He knew they would see the exposure and assume incompetence or rashness. And on some level, though this is the historian's inference rather than the documented record, he may have counted on that assumption to buy him the time he needed. When you look like you've made a fatal mistake to your enemy, and your enemy begins organizing to exploit that mistake, you have done something remarkable. You have made their plan dependent on your error, and if the error isn't real, if what looked like overextension was actually a carefully calculated operational maneuver, then the enemy's response, the counterattack they launched to destroy you, becomes the thing that destroys them. This is a form of strategic deception that operates not through lies or false information, but through the manipulation of perception. Patton moved in ways that, when viewed through a conventional lens, looked like a mistake. The Germans trusted their conventional lens. They attacked on the basis of what they saw, and the result was the Falaise Pocket. But the story of why the Germans thought Patton had made a fatal mistake goes deeper than tactics and logistics. It goes into the psychology of the men involved, and into the particular genius that Patton possessed, which was unlike almost any other senior Allied commander of his generation. Most generals, most successful generals, not just mediocre ones, are fundamentally risk-averse. Not cowardly, but cautious in the way that any man responsible for hundreds of thousands of lives must be cautious. They weigh the cost of failure, they protect the gains they've made, they consolidate before advancing. They are defined, in their deepest professional instincts, by the memory of what can go wrong. Patton was not wired this way. He was capable of caution when he chose it. He was not simply a wild cavalryman throwing his forces into the teeth of the enemy with no thought for consequence. His campaigns show, on close analysis, a profound understanding of risk. But it was an understanding that always began from the other direction. He started with the question of what could be won and worked backward to find the minimum acceptable level of security that would allow him to go for it. Most generals started with the question of what could be lost and worked forward to find the maximum acceptable level of risk. This is a subtle difference, but it produced dramatically different outcomes. A general who starts with the fear of failure will always be more conservative than the situation actually demands, because the fear of failure gives everything a weight that pure calculation would not assign it. A general who starts with the vision of what winning looks like will always be more aggressive than his peers expect, because he is optimizing for the win rather than the survival. The Germans expected Patton to be cautious because every other American general they had faced, when confronted with the kind of exposed position Patton was in, had been cautious, and that expectation, built up over years of fighting in North Africa and Italy in the early days of the Normandy campaign, was so deeply embedded in their assessment that they could not see past it. They knew Patton was bold, but they did not know, could not know without being inside his mind, that his boldness operated on a completely different calculus than they imagined. The Falaise operation settled the question of who had made the fatal mistake, but Patton's campaign did not end there. In the weeks following the encirclement, as the Allied armies surged across France, the Third Army continued to move at a pace that left German planners perpetually off balance. Paris fell. The Seine was crossed. The German armies in France, those that escaped Falaise, fled eastward in disorder. For a brief, shining window in late August and early September of 1944, there was a genuine possibility, argued by Patton with fierce intensity in meeting after meeting with Eisenhower and Bradley, that the war in Europe could be ended before Christmas. Patton believed it. He argued it with every tool at his disposal, from data to personal lobbying to, reportedly, outright begging. If the Third Army could be given sufficient fuel, he said, he could drive through Germany before the Wehrmacht recovered from the catastrophe of Normandy and Falaise. The German army was broken. It needed time to rebuild its lines, re-establish coherent defense, bring up reserves. If you didn't give it that time, if you drove east and kept driving, you could end this thing now. The argument was not insane. Some historians believe even today that it was correct. It was rejected. The supply situation that Patton had managed with such precision during the breakout had reached its actual limit by early September. The Red Ball Express, the massive truck convoy system that kept Allied forces supplied, was running flat out and still couldn't keep up with the pace of the advance. Eisenhower, facing impossible choices about which armies to prioritize with limited fuel, chose to support Field Marshal Montgomery's operation in the north, Market Garden, rather than Patton's drive in the east. Patton was furious. He argued. He maneuvered. He reportedly ordered his supply officers to claim they had less fuel than they did to prevent it from being reallocated, an assertion that, if true, suggests the extent of his desperation. He told Eisenhower that if he could get 4,000 tons of supplies, he could be in Germany within 10 days. He didn't get them, and by the time the supply situation improved, the Germans had used the pause to do exactly what Patton had feared. They rebuilt their lines. The Siegfried Line, the West Wall, was manned again. The Wehrmacht, which had been shattered in August, had knitted itself back together in the ways that only an army of its professionalism and resilience could. The window that Patton had seen, that brief, extraordinary opening, had closed. The remaining months of 1944 were brutal in a way that the summer had not been. The Third Army fought through the fortifications of Metz, through the dense forests of the Saar, through autumn mud and winter cold, against an enemy that was fighting now with its back to its homeland and the particular ferocity that desperation produces. But even in this grinding phase, something of the summer remained in Patton's methods and in the German response to them. Because even now, after Falaise, after the race across France, after everything that should have made the German commanders recalibrate their assumptions about what Patton would and wouldn't do, there were moments when German planners still fell into the same trap. They still, at key junctures, assumed that Patton would not do what Patton would do. The Battle of the Bulge is the most dramatic example of this. Though in that case, the story runs slightly differently, because Patton was not the attacker. He was the rescuer. When the German offensive in the Ardennes struck on December 16, 1944, it caught the Allied command structure in various degrees of shock and confusion. Units were surrounded. The front was shattered. Bastogne, the crucial road junction that controlled movement across the entire region, was encircled by German armored forces and in danger of falling. At a crisis meeting with Eisenhower and the other senior commanders, with German forces still advancing and the situation still deteriorating, Patton made a statement that provoked outright skepticism in the room. He said he could turn the Third Army north, disengage from its current operations on a completely different axis, and have a relief column striking toward Bastogne within 3 days. The room, by most accounts, did not immediately believe him. Not because they doubted his will, but because what he was describing was, by any conventional measure of what armies could do, impossible. You don't take an entire army, hundreds of thousands of men, thousands of vehicles, all its artillery and supply, disengage it from one front, rotate it 90 degrees, and attack in a completely different direction in 72 hours. Armies don't move like that. Armies are enormous, complicated, ponderous things that require days just to receive and distribute new orders, let alone execute them. Patton had anticipated the request. Before the meeting, while other commanders were still absorbing the news of the German attack, Patton had already been working with his staff on contingency plans. He had 3 separate operation orders ready, depending on exactly where and how he was asked to intervene. When Eisenhower told him what was needed, Patton already had the plan in his pocket. He turned the Third Army north. On December 26th, exactly 3 days later, the first elements of the Third Army, the 4th Armored Division, broke through the German encirclement and reached Bastogne. The Germans had not believed it was possible. They had not planned for it. The timetable of their Ardennes operation had not accounted for an American response of that speed, from that direction, in that strength. The argument against Patton's relief operation, the calculation that said an army couldn't do what he was proposing, was exactly the same argument that the Germans in France had made in August. It was based on what armies normally did, not on what this particular army, with this particular commander, was capable of. And once again, the Germans paid for that miscalculation in the most direct possible way. There is a thread running through all of these moments, through the breakout, through Falaise, through the race across France, through the Bulge, that reveals the essential nature of the German failure to understand Patton. They always evaluated him against a standard of what was normal, and Patton was never normal. This was not an accident. It was not simply a matter of Patton being reckless or lucky or blessed by circumstance. It was the product of a lifetime of deliberate, intense, almost obsessive preparation for exactly this kind of warfare. Patton had been studying cavalry, and by extension, mechanized armored operations, since the early 20th century. He had been one of the first Americans to use tanks in combat in World War I, and he had spent the following 2 decades thinking about what tanks could do if freed from the constraints that conventional doctrine placed on them. He had written papers, he had argued in meetings. He had, at various points in his career, been dismissed, sidelined, and told that his ideas about speed and mobility and deep penetration were too aggressive, too risky, not suitable for the realities of modern war. And then modern war arrived, and it turned out that the realities of modern war were exactly what Patton had been describing all along. The blitzkrieg that Germany had used to stunning effect in 1939 and 1940, the fast, armored thrusts that collapsed France and drove deep into the Soviet Union, was, in its essential philosophy, identical to what Patton had been arguing for years. Speed, shock, deep penetration. Strike before the enemy can respond. Keep moving. Don't let them recover. Patton had not been inspired by blitzkrieg. He had been ahead of it. When he saw German armored operations in the early war years, he recognized them not as something new, but as something he had already worked out from first principles. This is crucial to understanding why the Germans couldn't read him correctly. They thought of blitzkrieg as their doctrine, developed in their institutions, embedded in their culture of military thinking. They were, in many ways, its inventors. And when they saw Patton applying something that looked like blitzkrieg, they saw it through the lens of how they would have applied it, which meant they knew where the edges were. They knew the doctrine's limits. They knew when an operation had gone past the point where it could be sustained. What they didn't account for was that Patton had arrived at the same philosophy through a different route, and that his version of it had different edges. Because he had worked it out himself, from fundamental principles, he was not constrained by the specific doctrinal answers the Germans had settled on. He had his own answers to the questions of how far to go and when to stop, and those answers were, in almost every case, more aggressive than anything the German commanders expected. They were playing by their rules. He was playing by his, and they assumed the rules were the same. It's worth thinking about the human dimension of all this, because military history can sometimes become so focused on units and positions and dates that it loses the reality of the men involved. The German officers who made these assessments were not faceless bureaucrats. They were men who had survived years of war on multiple fronts. They had seen friends and colleagues die. They had made their own brave decisions under impossible pressure. They were, by any reasonable measure, among the most capable military professionals of their generation. And they were sitting in rooms in August 1944, looking at maps that showed Patton's columns racing across France, and they genuinely believed that he had made an error that would cost him everything. Try to imagine what that feels like. You have spent years studying this enemy. You have built up a picture of how he thinks, how he fights, what risks he will take, and where he will stop. You have applied your best professional judgment to the evidence in front of you, and your judgment tells you that what you're seeing is not bold strategy, but fatal overreach. The enemy has given you an opening. All you have to do is hit it, and then you hit it, and it turns out there was no opening. The thing that looked like a mistake was a trap, not a deliberate trap in the sense of a planned deception, but a trap nonetheless, one created by the gap between what you assumed about your enemy and who your enemy actually was. This is in some ways the most instructive lesson of the entire story. Military defeat, real, catastrophic, war-changing defeat, rarely comes purely from one side being stronger than the other. It usually comes from one side knowing the other side less well than they think they do. The German command structure in France, in August 1944, was not defeated primarily by American firepower or American logistics or even American strategy. It was defeated, in significant part, by its own assumptions. The assumption that Patton had made a fatal mistake was not evidence of German incompetence. It was evidence of how deeply any military organization becomes embedded in its own doctrinal framework, and how difficult it is to step outside that framework and see an adversary clearly, on his own terms, rather than through the lens of what you already believe you know. Patton understood this in the way that great commanders throughout history have understood it. He understood that the enemy's assumptions were part of the battlefield, as real and as exploitable as any hill or river or fortified position. He moved in ways that he knew would produce certain assumptions in the German mind, and then he exploited those assumptions. This is not the same as saying he deliberately invited them to think he'd made a mistake. The historical record doesn't support that level of calculated deception, but it does support the conclusion that Patton was acutely aware of how he was being read by the enemy, that he considered German perceptions as part of his operational calculus, and that the gap between what the Germans expected and what he actually delivered was, for him, not a happy accident, but a predictable outcome of fighting a certain way against a certain kind of opponent. There is one more dimension to this story that deserves attention, because it speaks to something even deeper than tactics or logistics or operational art. Patton was, in the summer of 1944, fighting with something to prove. He had been sidelined after the slapping incidents in Sicily, when he struck two soldiers he accused of being cowards, and the resulting scandal had nearly ended his career. He had spent months watching the Normandy campaign unfold without him, running a ghost army in England as part of the Allied deception operations, while other commanders, Bradley among them, a man Patton personally outranked in the pre-war army, led the most important operation in the history of American arms. When the Third Army was finally activated and Patton finally had his command, he was not simply executing a military operation. He was making a statement. He was answering everyone who had said he was too dangerous, too unstable, too unpredictable to be trusted with major command. He was proving, with every mile his tanks covered, that the man the army had sidelined was the man the army most needed. This personal dimension did not make him reckless, but it added to the intensity with which he drove himself and his army forward. He was not going to stop unless stopped. He was not going to consolidate unless forced to. He was not going to hand his critics the evidence they were looking for. And the Germans, who knew Patton's professional record but could not fully know his personal situation, could not factor this dimension into their calculations. They saw a general moving fast. They assumed the fast movement would produce the same caution it always produced in other generals, the moment of pause, where you realize how far you've gone and pull back slightly to secure the position. That pause never came. It didn't come because Patton wouldn't let it come. And it didn't come because the operation was designed, from the beginning, to keep moving until something outside stopped it. The something outside that finally stopped it was not the Germans. It was the fuel gauge. And even then, even when the Third Army sat on the approaches to Germany with empty tanks and Patton raging at the supply bureaucracy, the Germans had used the pause to rebuild, and still it took them months of hard fighting to stabilize their line, because the damage Patton had done in August and September was so severe that there wasn't really enough left of the German army in the West to hold him forever. The war ended on May 8, 1945. Germany surrendered unconditionally. Patton was in Czechoslovakia when the ceasefire came. He was not happy about it. He wanted to keep going. He had a new enemy in mind. But that is a different story. The story that matters here. The story that begins with a German officer standing over a map in August 1944, saying quietly that Patton had made a fatal mistake, ends not with a single dramatic moment, but with a gradual, terrible realization. The realization spread through German headquarters over days and then weeks. It came in pieces, with each new report of American columns somewhere they weren't supposed to be able to reach, with each new encirclement, with each new town that fell hours after it was supposed to be defended for days. The realization was this: they had been wrong about him, not wrong about the exposure, not wrong about the risks, but wrong about the man, wrong about what he was capable of, wrong about how he had calculated the situation, wrong about the extent to which he had already solved the problems they assumed he hadn't noticed. Patton had not made a fatal mistake in August 1944. The Germans had. And their fatal mistake was believing, on the basis of everything they thought they knew, that a commander who moved like Patton must have lost control, when in fact he was moving exactly like that because he was completely in control, completely aware of what he was doing, and completely certain that his enemy would see danger where there was none, and miss the real trap that was closing around them. History is full of moments when a decision looks catastrophically wrong in real time and catastrophically right in retrospect. August 1944 in France is one of the clearest examples of that dynamic ever recorded. The man who looked like he was gambling with the lives of his soldiers was actually, by his own lights, the most careful commander on the battlefield. Careful not in the conventional sense of caution and consolidation, but in the deeper sense of someone who has thought through every consequence, accepted every risk that he can manage, and rejected every hesitation that doesn't serve the mission. George S. Patton was many things. He was flawed and difficult and infuriating and brilliant and brave and sometimes almost impossibly hard to work with. He was the general other generals resented and the general the enemy feared. He was the man who could make an entire German army planning a counterattack pause and recalculate, simply by moving in ways that didn't fit the expected pattern. He was, in the end, exactly the kind of commander that the crisis of August 1944 demanded. And the Germans, looking at their maps and their reports and their careful assessments of what he had done, thought he had handed them a victory. He had handed them a defeat. The only fatal mistake in the summer of 1944 was the one made by the men who thought they understood him.